Our document is called 2020 Vision World Perspectives. The first part of that title is, of course, a pun that I couldn't resist. But what do we mean when we talk about perspectives? The word implies not just an awareness of our immediate surroundings, but some insight into how these will shift, not just where we are, but where we're going. A mere freeze frame description of current reality at any given moment is misleading because it obscures the underlying tensions gnawing away below the surface. Looking at the world around us, a shallow observer will only see disaster and defeat. If we emphasize what's positive, then that's simply a necessary correction and not just an insight into the hidden contradictions, if you like, and the seeds of hope. Without a compass with which to orientate ourselves, without a perspective, we can't make a meaningful plan. But perspective is one thing, and clairvoyance is something else, especially at times of rapid change, with processes constantly rushing and bouncing against one another and interacting and colliding. Only a fraud would claim to predict events with any degree of accuracy. Unfortunately, there are many such charlatans who claim to be Marxists and who delude themselves that they alone have the answers. Life has a constant habit of springing surprises and posing new questions. We're often accused of over-optimism. Some left sects ritualistically reaffirm their faith in the working class. We don't operate on blind faith. On its current course, we're heading into a catastrophe, but that fate can be avoided. Marx quoted Hegel, a very favorite quote of mine: all that is real is rational, all that is rational is real. Since socialist revolution is in fact the only rational way forward, so it is reasonable to assume the possibility of its realization. But of course, there are no guarantees. Much of the current debate within WIN is about differing assessments of the current balance of forces in society. Is the monster reaction a growing menace? Will the working class fall prey once again to fascism or war? Or will it rise to its feet and liberate itself? Unfortunately, as at every crucial turning point in history, the answer is ambiguous. The answer is actually both. There is a sharp polarization in society. Reaction is swelling in equal measure to the radicalization and the growing combativity of the masses. We're not ashamed of the controversies that are conducted within WIN. We're proud of them because they demonstrate that we're a living, growing force, a crucible of scientific laboratory experiment and not a mummified mausoleum of ideas. Many us have been members of groups where there was no controversy, not because disagreement was banned, but because due to the respect and loyalty for the leadership, it was never challenged. The leaders persisted in mistakes until it was too late to correct them. That's why WIN will not just tolerate dissent, but insist on a culture of constant challenge and debate in order to test out our ideas, knock away obsolete misconceptions, and constantly sharpen our vision. Now, it's impossible to understand the course of events today just within narrow national horizons. Politics, economics, communications, and consciousness can only be measured on an international scale today. Perhaps the stupidest statement ever made is that of one capitalist ideologue who in 1991 celebrated what he called the end of history. His timing was, I think, a little misplaced. In the 30 years since then, I think we'll all agree there's been quite a lot of history. It can end in one of two ways: either the end of our barbaric prehistory and the dawn of a new age of civilization, or it could mean the literal end of all history. In other words, the end of human existence. Ultimately, no other outcome is conceivable. On the contrary, we're entering the most disturbed, unstable, volatile period in history. In 2018, when we named our new journal On the Brink, to some people it seemed perhaps a bit exaggerated or premature. 2 years later, how dated that title already sounds. We're not on the brink, we're well over the precipice. 2 decades into the 21st century, scientific and technological advances now offer humanity potential prospects that had hardly been dreamed of by previous generations. As recently as the early 90s, mobile phones and the internet were futuristic fantasies. Remember the books of Douglas Adams? The very fact that we can meet like this today would have seemed miraculous, even in those days. In a rationally harmonized society, science could within a generation have achieved almost limitless potential to save the environment and magically transform human existence with the deployment of 3D printing, robots, renewable energy sources, synthetic meat, electric cars, energy efficiency, new battery technology, mechanization, automation, digitalization, artificial intelligence, etc. And yet, today, life is ever more dangerous. Even if it were not for the social explosions that are coming, terror, repression, or war, then in any case, environmental degradation is already threatening the very survival of the species. Most of the recent natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, volcanic eruptions, forest fires, tsunamis, etc., are linked to a human cause. These environmental catastrophes have already triggered local wars, civil wars, mass migration, and of course, a huge refugee crisis. Already before the pandemic, world capitalism was hurtling towards disaster. During the winter of 2008 to 9, trade and industrial production collapsed at a faster rate even than during the Great Depression. In the 10 years since then, the world capitalist economy has barely inched along at sluggish rates of growth and investment. Aggregate global debt has already reached the equivalent of nearly 250% of the world's GDP. And despite massive quantitative easing, the central bank's magical creation of virtual money, declining rates of profit have already kept productive investment at a standstill. A huge ballast of loose cash was sloshing around the economy, flooding into land speculation, property, artwork, and predatory asset stripping. Before the pandemic, the accumulated shortfall in the rise of world output set against the projections from the preceding growth rate was already the equivalent of the disappearance of the entire German economy. The world economy was already a minefield packed with explosive material, corporate debt, protectionism, competitive devaluations, the start of a global trade war, most ominously a slowdown in the Chinese economy. So we wrote in the, We wrote in the 2020 document that the economy is increasingly vulnerable to the shocks that lie ahead. But what a shock was about to come. The most immediate manifestation of environmental catastrophe is the pandemic. Of course, it's not an act of God, it's a crime of capitalism. It's not a freak accident, but a direct consequence of capitalist vandalism of the natural habitat, the relentless encroachment of capitalist agribusiness. Mercenary mass factory farming was long known to breed viral diseases which easily spread from animals to humans. Only rarely, like with the Black Death in the 14th century or the flu epidemic of 1918, has such a simultaneous existential crisis gripped the entire world. The nearest equivalent, of course, were the 2 world wars. But in terms of disease, most of us were aware of such nightmares only from literature, those of the books of Defoe, of Albert Camus, of Jack London. Uncannily, by the way, Jack London's prediction in his book, The Scarlet Plague, was not far out even of its timing. He dated it at 2013. So far, at least 85 million people have been infected and almost 2 million, probably more, killed. The toll is rising by some 15,000 deaths per day. Yes, vaccines are coming to the rescue, but listen to Dr. Ryan of the World Health Organization, who said, this pandemic is not necessarily the big one. This is a wake-up call. The planet is fragile. So the writing is on the wall. Worse plagues are coming. Capitalism is poisoning the earth and leading to the threat of the extinction of human life. More than 100 years ago, Rosa Luxemburg summed up the alternatives facing humanity: socialism or barbarism. Even disregarding the social storms that are approaching, what else could we call the spectre of plague and environmental catastrophe but a threat of utter barbarism? The crisis, of course, is not caused by the pandemic, but it's grossly inflamed by it. Stalling growth already led to rising unemployment and triggered mass uprisings. There were already disproportionate levels of corporate and government debt. With interest rates still at record lows since the 2008 recession, there's little room for maneuver. So 2020 has already been an economic catastrophe, the worst since the slump of 1709. What are the prospects for recovery? Well, as Michael Roberts tells us, certain, of course there'll be a recovery. But as our comrade has explained, and this is in line with the forecasts of the IMF, the World Bank, and the OECD, there's no chance of a V-shaped recovery, a return to earlier growth rates. The pandemic has caused the collapse of many companies already. The accumulation of corporate debt and sovereign debt will slash investment prospects, and the risk looms ahead of a credit crunch and financial collapse. I'm sorry, I've lost my place. Of course, not everybody will suffer. One remarkable phenomenon today, and one factor in the approaching revolution, is the extraordinary growing gap, the polarization of wealth, the accumulation of riches at one pole, and at the same time a misery at the opposite pole. In 2018, despite the recession, billionaires saw their combined fortunes growing by $2.5 billion per day, while the relative wealth of the world's poorest half, 3.8 billion people, was declining by $500 million per day. Every day, Jeff Bezos of Amazon gets $250 million richer. Already 4 years ago, 8 billionaires owned as much of the poorest half of the world population. In the 7 months from March to October 2020, America's 614 billionaires grew their net worth by a collective $931 billion to reach a record collective wealth of $10.2 trillion. And when working people feel that their sacrifices are futile, that's what puts revolution on the agenda. It's not only the Marxists who are aware of that. Listen to the former IMF boss, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, warning of social unrest and rising social discontent in nations all around the world. Then Joseph Stadler, head of a club called the Global Ultra High Net Worth. This is something billionaires are concerned about. At what point will society intervene and strike back? And then there's Nick Hanauer, who I quoted in the 2020 document, who said, unless our policies change dramatically, we'll be back to late 18th century France before the revolution. Jeff Bezos had already become the first person ever to have a net worth valued at more than $180 billion. But the news 2 days ago is that Jeff Bezos has been overtaken. Now, Elon Musk has overtaken him by another couple of billion. Musk is now the wealthiest person alive. If we look at a previous holder of that title, who sat on a fortune estimated at between 300 and 400 billion in today's money, that person was Tsar Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, Nicholas II of Russia. And by the way, since his canonization by the Russian Orthodox Church, the richest saint in history. Okay, so the previous richest man on earth, look what happened to him. So we can look forward to great events. As wealth is concentrated at one end of the spectrum, the rest of society is sucked into the proletariat. The working class today is for the first time ever, majority of the world's population based on every continent. For every one worker in the West, there are now 5 based in China, Russia, Eastern Europe, Africa, Latin America, and the rest of Asia. There are now 3 billion wage workers worldwide, including 100 million industrial workers in China, more than double the number in all the G7 countries put together. China has now crossed the line to become a predominantly urban society. The specific weight of the proletariat on a world scale is the most decisive change in the world balance of forces, and women now constitute a majority of the working class and are right at the forefront of struggle, both as militant workers at the same time in their role as traditional custodians of the family. They are at the cutting edge of resistance to austerity. The ruling class are painfully aware of the dangers this poses. They looked already with fear at the growing revolt in Greece from 2011 to 2015, which not for the first time took the lead in the world revolution. In Greece, the bankers of Europe first came face to face with the rage of the masses. Within the space of 5 years, protests surged onto the streets in demonstrations, occupations, and literally countless general strikes, well over 50. It was the public spaces that became the site of mass discontent. Workers, pensioners, the unemployed, housewives, students, youth, small entrepreneurs, veterans, significantly also migrants and refugees, they all participated in this mass uprising. The occupation of the city squares, the most eloquent manifestation of popular outrage. In an opinion poll in 2011, 33% of the population opted for revolution, and a colossal 35% of the Greek population had personally taken part in at least one street demonstration, an amazing 1/3 of the population. And then came the famous referendum in July 2015, when 62% of the electorate, including a clear majority within nearly every single demographic category of the population, voted a resounding no to the bankers' demands. Almost 2/3 of the population were ready to defy the bankers at no matter what cost. Now, Varoufakis recounts the moment when Tsipras, the leader of a new left party created and elected to stand up to the bankers, confessed that he was going to capitulate due to personal cowardice, something which he spelt out in so many words and that could only have aroused contempt from the descendants of those hundreds of thousands of Greek heroes of past generations who had given their lives in the underground partisan resistance to the Nazi occupation, and then again in the civil war which followed, and of the hundreds of youth who died in the uprising against the colonel's dictatorship in 1973. Now, what we saw and what was warned of then by financiers, which quoted in the document, is that they knew that what happened in Greece was only a foreshadowing of what was going to come throughout Europe and throughout the world. And what we're seeing now is a new era has begun. The first promise of that future movement could already be traced in the anti-globalization protests involving thousands of youth at the turn of the millennium, traveling across continents to besiege the secret cabals of the oligarchs. In the 30 million who marched in 600 cities worldwide on the eve of the war in Iraq in 2003. In the worldwide Occupy movement in 2011, spontaneously leaping from continent to continent. In spontaneous uprisings spreading across entire regions like the Arab Spring. In the millions who took to the streets in 2013, in simultaneous protests throughout Turkey, Brazil, and Egypt, in the landmark cross-border general strike across Southern Europe in 2014. And there are many, many, I could go on. But of course, what we talk about now, what we need to look at is what's happening today. We've already witnessed, we've already documented the huge movement of revolutions leaping from continent to continent. Already before the crisis, there were uprisings on the streets in dozens of countries spread over 4 continents. But when we look today, I'm jumping over some of this, with only the briefest pause, the spark that ignited the Arab Spring in 2011 burst into flames already before the pandemic in dozens of countries around the world. In Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt in the Middle East, in Algeria, Sudan, and Guinea in Africa, in Ecuador, Chile, Colombia, Peru, in Latin America, in France, Hungary, Catalonia, and the Czech Republic in Europe, in India, Indonesia, and the Philippines in Asia, in Haiti and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, in Hong Kong, of course. The more truly universal outbreak of mass protests that we've ever seen before in history, more than in 1848. which was confined to Europe, more than in 1917 to 19, which is also mainly confined to Europe, more than in 1968. It's a worldwide turbulence, reflecting the unprecedented internationalization of the proletariat, which now straddles every continent, encompassing men and women alike, and now for the first time, a majority of the world population. And the kind of numbers involved, 1.3 million in Lebanon, 500,000 in Barcelona, 1/3 of the city's population, over 1 million in Chile, 100,000 in Iran, 200,000 in Colombia. There's never been such international turmoil, but hasn't the pandemic cut across this process? Well, there's an institution which monitors world instability. It's called the Verisk Maplecroft Civil Unrest Index. And it had already recorded, of course, 47 countries in 2019 with growing protest. But then it predicted in January more turmoil in 2020. And it had looked at, it looked back on epidemics throughout history, 57 epidemics between the Black Death and the Spanish flu. And it monitored how many revolts, rebellions, uprising, and protests had occurred in these same time periods. And it concluded, and I'm quoting, that major diseases of the past have often led to uprisings because of how those epidemics heightened social tensions. They concluded the economic shock of the pandemic, coupled with existing grievances, makes widespread public uprisings inevitable. They said it's a tinderbox. It doesn't take as much as it did a year ago. So let's look at the world in 2020. I won't say anything about the magnificent revolution in Belarus because we're proud to have its most radical leaders here with us today, and they will speak for themselves. 5 months of mass demonstrations facing brutality, torture, and assassination. Similarly, I won't speak about Black Lives Matter in the USA. We have comrade right at the leadership of this from Louisville, Comrade Tia. I won't speak about the protests in Zimbabwe because those comrades again are with us, or the year-long Gilets jaunes uprising in France and the wave of strikes. We have French comrades who can report much better than I can. These have been joined by movements in every continent, in Thailand, Indonesia, Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador, Nigeria, Guinea, above all, by the way, in India. Just to give, let me speak a little bit about some of those. In India, 3 times in less than 5 years, India has been brought to a complete standstill by general strikes of 200 million workers. In fact, in the latest case, reaching 250 million, 1/4 billion workers. A general strike, national blockade of roads and transport, joined by an uprising of peasants, up to 300 million, who marched on Delhi and occupied the streets of Delhi. I could go on and on and on giving details. It encompassed every nook and cranny of society and every corner of the subcontinent. In Nigeria, a movement involving thousands and thousands and thousands, that's a quote from a report, of young Nigerians standing up in wave after wave of protest against police bullets, most of the participants being aged between 18 and 24 years old. In Sudan, which of course already had started its revolution in 2018, but as late as in December 2020, just a couple of weeks ago, thousands of Sudanese protesters once again on the streets, demanding increased, accelerated reform. In Chile, after heroic demonstrations in which dozens of people were killed, in October, they voted by a majority by a percentage of 78.28%. They voted to throw out the old constitution of Pinochet, finally purging the evil of the coup of 1973. In Thailand, demonstrations of up to 100,000 youth against the surviving feudal monarchy. In Lebanon, and by the way, our comrades from the Lebanon have sent their heartfelt apologies. They promised to follow the conference on video and maybe come to future sessions. But we saw again hundreds of thousands who took to the streets last October, again only 3 months ago, and saying we're fighting for our human rights. We don't have anything to lose anymore. Of course, as I said, I won't mention the huge demonstrations of the Black Lives Matter protests in America, but around the world, there were sympathy demonstrations and protest marches in 85 countries, including, by the way, workers at a base in Antarctica. So should I continue? Bulgaria, Kyrgyzstan, Peru, again, just a huge worldwide uprising. Right now, it's against that context that we have to consider the flip side of the coin, the rise of the far right. It's a horrible spectre from the past. We've monitored in the document the rise of the right in country after country after country. And certainly we're witnessing horrors like the bloodbath in Syria on a scale equivalent to the Spanish Civil War, the thousands of migrants drowned in the Mediterranean, the forcible separation of children from their families at the Mexican border, wholesale deportations, mass incarceration in refugee camps, the official denunciations of entire peoples, Mexicans, African migrants, Italian Roma, as animals. This is the resurgence of long-buried nightmares. And we have to say, put that in the context of what has happened just days ago in America. The richest and best armed power in the world history is crumbling before our eyes into chaos. It's ironic, it's a huge irony that the power that inflicted countless military coups around the world has suddenly found itself a victim of an attempted coup back home. And the USA, if you like, it's imminent danger of falling into the category almost of a failed state. Now, what does this mean? Certainly this riot constitutes an ominous warning, all the more so given the obvious collusion of a section of the police in allowing the invasion of the Capitol building. But it also exposed the weakness of reaction. It stripped bare not just the ultimate threat, but also the ineptitude, the farcical ineptitude of the fascists, and it will sharpen and accelerate the radicalization of the youth, the black population, the oppressed and the exploited. Already some years ago, in successive opinion polls, 54% of respondents in America voted yes to the idea of, quote, political revolution to redistribute money from the wealthiest Americans. That included 68% of Afro-Americans, 65% of Hispanics, 68% of 18 to 29-year-olds. Trump's aborted putsch will surely speed up their radicalization and that of the youth, the women, the black population, and the working class, including the mass of currently non-unionized casual and zero-hours workers, and stiffen their resistance. Now, looking for historical parallels. In 1920 in Berlin, a coup was staged by an ultra-right official called Kapp. Without the support at that stage of the ruling circles of the establishment, his government lasted a mere 2 days before a general strike was called and he was forced to flee the city. The Kapp putsch was, of course, a deadly serious warning of the indescribable horrors that were to come. But it was a premature and ill-considered escapade which in the meantime pushed society further to the left. Another example. In Spain in 1981, some fascist officers led by Colonel Tejero stormed into the parliament chamber, fired shots into the air, forced the parliamentarians into the undignified posture of hiding trembling under their leather benches. We've seen similar antics on the part of the AWB in South Africa, who in the early 1990s tried to stage a rearguard revolt against majority rule. In all of these cases, lacking for the moment the dominant sectors of the ruling class behind them, and faced with the population thirsting for liberation, these creatures were humiliated. And isn't that the same, more or less, what we have seen even more graphically in Washington this week? Yes, this lumpen rabble constitutes a future danger, but for now, they're humiliated. There are strict limits to the powers of the aspiring dictators around the world. Trump apparently has gone. Salvini has gone. Johnson, I predict, will not last his full term. Orban, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Modi, Duterte, they're all facing threats to their rule. I would like to give more examples, but I'm conscious of the passage of time. Look at, above all, in India, though. Narendra Modi's BJP won a landslide majority in a general election just 18 months ago, and is now confronted by a mass uprising of hundreds of millions of workers, peasants, and the poor. So history is at a turning point. How do we describe what's happening? We've quoted before, but I'd like to remind Hegel's haunting lines: "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk." A poetic image, meaning that it's only in retrospect that a historical epoch can be neatly classified. But I would say that what we're seeing is, to give just one more quote, Gramsci, which we reminded of only a couple of weeks ago by Comrade Felicity: "The old is dying and the new cannot be born. And in this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." So the old system is in a state of collapse, and yet a viable alternative has yet to materialize. Now, we've seen the arena of struggle now is not just in the workplaces, but on the streets. From Tiananmen Square in Beijing, Palace Square, Bucharest, Wenceslas Square, Prague. But now we have to add, and there's many, many more which are listed in the document, but now we have to talk about the public squares in Algiers, Khartoum, Minsk, Beirut, Bangkok, Lagos. So hundreds of thousands have been marching and mobilizing. And that's why we're on the eve of the development of Sleeping Giant. So what is the role of WIN in creating the basis for a new international? This is the last point I want to make. The need of the hour is a new international, drawing together these movements of the masses into a common program. It's not for Marxists simply to lecture the workers on the basis of what they've learned from the textbooks. It was the workers of Paris in the Commune of 1871 who demonstrated to Marx, and not the other way around, the necessity of smashing and replacing the bourgeois state machine rather than simply commandeering it. It was the workers of St. Petersburg in 1905 who, by their own spontaneous improvisation, formed the Soviets as democratic organs of workers' power against the wishes of the local Bolsheviks, who were initially distrustful of what they perceived as a threat to their precious leading role of the party. Trotsky was its chair, and it was to the lasting credit of Lenin, at that time they belonged to different factions, that the Bolsheviks were so quick to acknowledge the form of organization that workers created. There are many, many, many examples, and I don't want to to put them down before you again today. But we in WIN today, unlike so many left groups, we're not playing Menshevik and Bolshevik computer games. We're not retired generals constantly playing war games in which we're fighting yesterday's wars. When Trotsky called for a fourth international in 1938, everyone knew what he meant, because millions of people, millions of workers were already affiliated to either the Second Socialist International or the Third Communist International. And it meant that it was a declaration that these were no longer fit for purpose and a fourth needed to be built. Trotsky had authority as the leader of the 1905 revolution, the co-leader of the October Revolution, the founder of the Red Army, the organizer of the left opposition. Who are we? We still have to earn our credentials. We can't propose resolutions committing the workers to a worldwide general strike as the Socialist International did in 1912, because there is no such international body. We can't proclaim a new international imposing strict conditions for membership and denying membership to the old leaders, as Lenin did in 1919, because we don't have the authority of having led the working class to power. So what we have to think is, what would Marx do in the current situation? Well, looking at Marx in the run-up to the 1848 revolutions, he corresponded patiently and tirelessly with committed socialists around the world, and that mainly meant in three countries, in England, France, and Germany, trying to win them, trying to link them with the revolution wherever it manifested itself, trying to draw them to a common program, and raising the banner of a future international. I found a letter that Marx wrote in 1846 to someone who was a bit of a surprise to me, someone who later became, in fact, very, very soon, within months, became an implacable political opponent of Marx, a man against whose ideas Marx wrote entire books. But in 1846, in March 1846, he wrote a letter to Proudhon in Paris. He didn't denounce him, he praised him, and he cordially invited him to a discussion. And he invited him to join into a dialogue with his comrades in a handful of other countries. What was he doing? Far from the popular caricatures, Marx didn't just denounce those who didn't support his point of view, insist on unanimity. He patiently argued his case, but he was painstakingly creating a network. And that's what WIN is doing. At this stage, our guidelines are three things. One, political education. That is the key to everything. In our documents, in our journal, in our Zoom meetings, some comrades have asked, what's the point of our Zoom meetings? Precisely to educate ourselves and to educate all the periphery around us. Secondly, active participation in the labour movement, as we have, for instance, in our intervention in the NEC elections in the Labour Party in Britain. And three, building links worldwide. Marx and Engels had no internet. They had no Zoom. With the enormous advantages that we have, we're doing what they were doing at a comparable stage. We're establishing a workers' international network, linking genuine worker activists and socialists worldwide and laying the foundations, we hope, for a future international which can, must, and will become a movement of tens of millions. Thank you, comrades.